So we're just going to go over a couple of connections that we found interesting and wanted to share with each other from our readings. So I'll go first. For this chapter, as I was reading, I was really interested in the comparisons between the communication modes between deaf people and hearing people from the times of Martha's Vineyard compared to now. So I was kind of looking at connections or differences between that. And I found that back then in Martha's Vineyards, basically everyone knew sign language. That's literally the title of our book. So there wasn't really a communication gap between deaf and hearing people on the island. So I thought it was interesting how our book elaborated on how the community was so integrated, like both linguistically and as a collective culture, like deaf culture and the culture and community of the island was essentially one and the same. So that was really cool. And hearing islanders apparently had no difficulty communicating with the deaf. So that just goes to show you like how much sign language was used. And then connecting that to like the current time in our mainstream society now, deaf culture and the hearing society are very different, and there's huge barriers in the modes of communication. Like there's very few people, I think, that know sign language who aren't connected to deaf culture or someone who is deaf in some way. So nowadays they were talking about some of like the modes of communication. Hearing people and deaf people will sometimes write notes to communicate, which was not done on Martha's Vineyard because one, everyone knew how to sign, and two, people weren't as literate back then in the 17th and 18th century. And that included deaf people, like especially because they didn't have that connection to the verbal English. And I was reading and I saw a quote from the book, and it said, "In the larger society off island, hearing individuals often communicate with deaf persons by written notes, but there is no indication that this was done on the island." And that was when like the author was going through interviewing a bunch of people, and that's what she found. She also found that none of the deaf vineyarders read lips either. So now there's a lot of technological advances that can help with communication, but I thought that was really interesting to connect how people communicated back then to how people communicate now with the deaf community.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so my connection is, well, one of the aspects of this book that really stood out to me was the idea of language acquisition.
Yes.
Language acquisition is obviously a big part of our major pre-speech pathology.
Mm-hmm.
It's really touched on in a lot of our courses like linguistics and language development. So this might be a little bit obvious, but on the island, their first natural language was sign language, and that's just what they were brought up to know. And that was their household language. There was a quote on page 55 in our book, and it said, "None of my informants remember any formal teaching of sign language," which obviously with language acquisition, it's just natural. You just kind of catch on with time.
Right.
So for us, obviously, English is our naturally picked up language, and it's just interesting comparing simple language acquisition based on your location and who you're surrounded by and just what you're being brought up in. And for them on Martha's Vineyard, it was just so natural to learn sign language, and they didn't think twice about it.